Kwe Tansei Seigo. Hi, my name is Pam Palmater, and welcome back to my new YouTube channel, State of the Nations, where we talk about critical issues impacting Indigenous nations all over our sovereign territories on Turtle Island. Today we're going to be talking about all the buzz about name changes on buildings and name changes on street signs, the removal of statues, the changes of names on school boards, and what does all of this mean? We hear a lot of talk about Sir John A. Macdonald and Governor Cornwallis and other people who are considered to be icons of Canada and the founding of Canada, Canada's Confederation, but there's a lot of people upset about what their name also stands for, and that is the genocide, deaths, and destruction of Indigenous peoples, and how in a relationship going forward that's based on reconciliation do we reconcile these two very conflicting sets of values. So the debate is, really, do we remove statues of offending people like Sir John A. Macdonald, who promoted the genocide of Indigenous peoples? Or do we replace his statue with one of an Indigenous hero, someone who made significant contributions to Canada or Indigenous nations before Confederation? Or do we add a plate to these statues to say, well, on the one hand they did this, but on the other hand they did some really harmful things? Or do we do nothing at all and leave everything as is? And there's a lot of debate that's happening around that right now, and I don't consider this negative in any way. I consider this an extremely positive sign that we're having these conversations, that reconciliation is more than just, I'm sorry for what happened in the past, why don't you just forget about it and move forward? That we're really talking about all the deeply ingrained symbolism and messages and signs all over, not just Canada, but the United States and other countries that have very troubled pasts with colonization. And what does this all mean? And these discussions, I think, are really important, not just for those of us who have been working in this a long time, but also for the youth who are coming up and trying to understand where is all of this coming from. And I think part of the difficulty is that there was a lot of Indigenous peoples and Canadians alike who found it very difficult after the Truth and Reconciliation report and learning even more about Canada's troubled history, for Prime Minister Trudeau to justify spending $500 million on a birthday party for Canada at the same time that they chronically underfund all of First Nations programs and services. They don't respect and implement First Nation treaty rights, land rights, or our right to be self-determining. And knowing that the very money that would be used to buy all of the hot dogs and birthday cake and fireworks and all of the other celebrations that happen across Canada is essentially blood money. It comes from the genocide of our people, the dispossession of our people, and the theft of our lands and resources, because that is the basis of Canada's wealth. Everything that Canadians enjoy, whether you're a Canadian that's been here for several generations or you're one who just arrived today, every benefit and opportunity that you have in this territory comes from the genocide and dispossession of Indigenous peoples. And so there's a really big disconnect between celebrating Canada 150 and all of the money that goes towards that, while not addressing all of the legacy of colonization and genocide in Canada. And it's hard to accept that Canada would use the very money from its own piracy to celebrate its own success, which it only has from doing so much harm to Indigenous peoples. And so I think this whole concept of Canada 150 really stirred up a lot of conversations in the public, a lot of difficult conversations, a lot of debate, but one that we have to have. Because here's the thing, decolonization is not easy. If it is, you're not decolonizing. Reconciliation, if done right, is not easy. If it is, you're not even down the path yet. It's difficult. Social change and social justice is difficult. In the entire history of human beings, no society, no nation has ever grown and prospered without having some amount of social conflict. And that's necessary to advance the cause of social justice for all people. Do you think human rights would even be something that's protected or talked about today if there wasn't conflict over advancing and protecting those rights? Certainly, as an Indigenous person, I can attest to the fact that we have never had anything given to us. We have literally had to fight tooth and nail on the ground with our lives, in the courts, with everything that we have for decades and decades just to have the rights that we have today. And so that kind of social conflict that's an inherent part of decolonization is inherently going to be part of this discussion around what do we do with all of these symbols of Canadian Federation, but at the same time Indigenous genocide. I mean, in Halifax, you have people wanting to remove the names and statues of Governor Cornwallis. And why is that? Cornwallis's name appears on schools, he's in statues, there's lots of things named after him, but he was a governor who issued a scalping bounty against Mi'kmaq people and paid people money to kill Mi'kmaq men, women, and children, which decimated our nation by upwards of 80%. That's pretty significant. That's almost near complete genocide of one Indigenous nation. Of course, Mi'kmaq people don't want to have to go to a school where they celebrate the person who scalped all of their ancestors. That wouldn't be different in any other country where people who engaged in horrific acts of genocide shouldn't be celebrated either. It shouldn't be celebrated here. In Ontario, you have the Ontario Teachers Federation, who literally just passed a resolution. They voted to encourage school boards to remove the name of Sir John A. Macdonald from schools. And the reason for that, it's not because they don't acknowledge that he made a contribution to Canadian Federation, but it's because he orchestrated, supported, and went through with very genocidal acts against Indigenous peoples for the sake of clearing the plains and clearing the country for settlements and railroads. He was more than happy to literally starve Indigenous peoples to death. And of course, he was also a part of all of the Indian policy that came afterwards, which was based on two primary things. One, Canada getting all of Indigenous lands and territories, and two, reducing any financial obligations they had for Indigenous peoples that they had acquired through treaties, agreements, and other obligations. And they only had two ways of doing this. One was assimilation, and the other was elimination. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about genocide. And so we have this conflict between people not wanting to let go of people and symbols and ideas and words that are considered Canadian icons, while at the same time other people questioning how can it possibly be a Canadian value to celebrate something as horrendous as genocide against Indigenous peoples. And we're talking about the loss of lives of millions of people in Canada, in the United States, and in other countries that were brutally colonized like Canada was. And part of the problem in all of this debate is that the vast majority of people don't have all the facts. We're not taught the full history of what happened to Indigenous peoples in schools, and we're certainly not taught at any major level about issues like genocide and what is genocide and how do you recognize it when it's outside of the context of the Holocaust or the war in Rwanda. It's always easier to look at other countries and say, that's terrible. But do people really understand what genocide is? And the vast majority don't. Now, the United Nations passed a convention on the prevention and punishment for the crime of genocide, and it very particularly stated that genocide are acts with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a particular group of people based on their race, their religion, their nationality, and that applies here in Canada. Now, they have 5 criteria, and while there's lots of criticism around the convention and the criteria and how it's applied in international law, for now what's important to know is that these 5 criteria that amount to genocide, for it to be genocide, only one of these criteria need to be in place. One is the killing of members of a particular group, like Indigenous peoples or Mi'kmaq peoples, for example. The physical or mental harm directed at members of that particular group. The other one is bringing about the conditions of life that are meant to destroy that particular group. So, forced starvation, for example. Another condition is preventing births in a particular group. And the last one is the forcible removal of children from one group of people to another group of people. So those 5 conditions, only one of them need to be present for it to be genocide. And in terms of Canada's history, all 5 are present. And that is something that it's very difficult for many Canadians to accept. I know in my classes it's often difficult for many of my students to accept because they simply haven't been taught about the realities of our history. Now, the debate is engaged in by a large number of people. Former Prime Minister Palmater himself talked about, residential schools being a form of cultural genocide. So while it wasn't any of these other really lethal areas, there was some loss of language and culture. Supreme Court of Canada Chief Justice Beverley McLaughlin said that residential schools amounted to an attempt to commit cultural genocide. Others in the debate say there was no genocide, cultural or otherwise. However, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, after extensive examination, review, and testimony of Canada's history and everything that has been done to Indigenous peoples, said it wasn't just cultural genocide that happened here in Canada. In fact, it was cultural, physical, and biological, that Canada was in fact guilty of genocide as genocide. So what do we do with that now? That's a very big question. We've got to consider the fact that even after Canada signed treaties, it enacted scalping bounty laws to scalp Mi'kmaq people to try to clear them from their land. Even after treaties of peace and friendship were signed and deals were made, First Nations were forced onto reserves, not allowed to leave, and literally starved to death. That this country was founded on Indian agents and police forces using food rations to extort sex from young Indigenous girls. That's how this country was founded. This is why Canada 150 is not a celebration for everyone. Other things that happened during our history was the forced sterilization of Indigenous girls that was in fact promoted by the famous 5, women who are celebrated as iconic heroes for advancing women's equality, but who also very much supported the forced sterilization of Indigenous women for population control, that is, to eventually eliminate us. All of these things that happened in our history, That's a crime in and of itself, and that crime hasn't been addressed. But the other crime, even the more offensive crime, is that Canada hasn't stopped these policies. For example, we have more kids stolen and trapped in foster care today than we ever did during the residential school period. There are people my age that were forcibly sterilized. We're still talking about forced and coerced sterilization of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples are still being starved on many First Nations. The very same issues that we consider so deplorable from the past are things that are happening today. And so when we're talking about genocide, whether you agree it's cultural or full genocide or not genocide at all, none of us are proud of Canada's history. We should be even more repulsed by the fact that it continues today and where we are, that we have all our kids overrepresented in foster care, that our people are overrepresented in prison, they go murdered and missing, they're taken on starlight tours and shot or assaulted by police officers, that they're chronically underfunded for education, housing, water. So many people don't even have access to the same kind of health care that Canadians take for granted. So of course, many of us are going to find it offensive to celebrate Sir John A. Macdonald or anybody else that came after him that promoted the genocide of Indigenous peoples or the theft and oppression of Indigenous peoples. But this discussion is one that we have to have. It's exceptionally important when we're talking about decolonization. And we also need to have a little discussion about apologies, because many people will say, well, we apologize for residential schools. Why can't you just get over it? And my response is always the same. How can we get over things that haven't stopped? And an apology is not something that's forced by litigation or a set of speaking notes. It doesn't matter how flowery you make an apology unless you make a full apology. And even kids on a playground know what a full apology is. It means that you acknowledge what happened, the harm that was done. You take responsibility for it. You say you're sorry and promise that you will never do it again. And the final and equally important step is making amends. What you do to undo the harm as much as you can for what has happened. And we're missing those critical steps. We have the flowery sorries, but we don't have any of the other steps where the promise is made to never do it again and the making of amends. We're still in this process. And I think until we get to that level, until we get to the stage where we're talking about making amends, real reconciliation, then we're going to be in this bumpy road of people now waking up to these issues, wanting to do something about it, not knowing what to do about it, so saying, well, let's get rid of these offensive signs. Let's remove their names. Let's take down these statues. And can they be blamed? They're trying to take action in place of Canada not taking action. And so unless and until Canada steps up and acknowledges what has happened and stop it from happening, then people of course are going to be engaged in this debate and doing what they can to advance the reconciliation and decolonization agenda. And so that's action on the ground. That's better than superficial words, and I think this is where we need to head. So thank you to everyone who has been engaged in this conversation and who are doing whatever they can to take whatever actions that they can to advance knowledge, reconciliation, decolonization, and a more just Canada. Thank you for watching State of the Nations. Please consider supporting me if you want to see more episodes and more content by subscribing in the links down below, sharing the videos and liking the videos with your friends, family, relatives, and social justice activists so we can change Canada and make it the way it was originally intended in the treaty relationship. Thank you.